Okay. Hello, hello. All right, let's get into it. This is the much-awaited panel session. So my name is Euwe Ermita. I'm the manager of Digital Library Systems and Services here at the library, and I've got the honour of moderating today's panel session. The topic of the panel session today is digitisation is not digital preservation, or is it? So this is a very hot and contentious topic. I've been in, digital preservation for about the last 7 years, and it's always a topic which can sway either direction. So with us today, we have the A team over here, the panel members. I'll firstly introduce Julia Mant. Julia is the Archives and Records Manager at the National Institute of Dramatic Art, or NIDA, and has been the president of the Australian Society of Archivists since October 2016. For Julia, the issue of digital preservation is both an immediate concern in her work at NIDA, where their holdings include a range of formats, including analogue, photographic, audio, and a large array of video formats. So welcome, Julia. We have Anna Henry. Anna is an archivist who has worked on digital archives, digitisation, and digital preservation for Archives New Zealand, TAPE, and the Royal Society. She's currently working on a business case for digitisation just down the road at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Welcome, Anna. And we have our very own Joe Fleming over here. Joe has worked at the library over the past 4 years and played a key role in the development of a digital preservation program. And this includes the development of a digital preservation policy, as well as the introduction of preservation standards to the point of acquisition. Joe's worked in this industry for over a decade in the acquisition of digital moving image collections and AV digital preservation. And she's also worked at the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia and National Archives of Australia. Welcome, Joe. And finally, we have Ross Harvey. Ross started thinking and writing about preservation in the 1980s. And this led to grappling with, yes, it's a long time. And this led to grappling with preserving digital stuff from the mid-90s. He has published 2 books about digital preservation. The first is called Digital Curation, the second is Preserving Digital Materials. And his focus is to encourage practitioners to think more actively about the big questions that digital preservation raises. So the why, who's it for, and what do they want? Rather than being preoccupied with the technical bells and whistles, which we can sometimes get lost into. So welcome, Ross. The structure of the panel today is each one of the speakers will have 5 minutes to state their position, either pro or against. We will then allow, at the end of that, each speaker to agree or disagree with each other. The latter half, we will then open up to the audience. So we have a roaming mic. Damien over there will come around. So please, because this is being live streamed, speak into the microphones and say who you are and where you're from. That will definitely help. And we'll also have Matt on social media watching, and Maria too, watching the tweets. So if there's any questions that come through there, we'll also do our best to have those answered. So in saying that, over to you, Julia, for the case.
Thanks so much, and hello everyone. I guess being on this panel, we are probably going to dissect little segments, and we're probably not in great disagreement. It's not a debate in that way, but it is a bit of a license to be provocative. So, of course, anything we say can be challenged, and that's what we want you to do. We want you to bring your questions and experiences here, because I think that's, in this sort of a room, the information sharing is the key to how we move forward on these things. So in saying that, I think this morning the run through the very many great projects and that we saw demonstrated really illustrate the practical issue of this question of digitisation versus digital preservation, and some of the answers and solutions that we might talk about were really in those papers as well. So I want to step back a little bit there and bring it up a little bit to this high level. Why has this question even been framed? Why are we thinking digitisation versus digital preservation? Why has that come about? And I think it is because there really is, there remains a real framing of the funding that's available to archives, libraries, museums, galleries, the GLAM sector around digitisation. And you heard some of the speakers this morning say that as well. That's where you can get the money. You can sell the access, the use, to some extent the preservation. You have to for the audiovisual records. We know that's built into it, so that's a case. And it's I suppose that prioritisation of digitisation is what has been of concern to me with my ASA hat on, and because I think that archivists in particular, we've actually been talking also for 30 years along with Ross about how you manage electronic records, or what we might now call digital records. And so how has it that this move to just creating more and more digital objects without building the understanding that we've had it for a long time, of how we manage those digital objects, how has it been that we've got this sort of dichotomy between the two? Because we work in the sector, that division is not as, we understand that there are the two parts, and that digitisation is part of digital preservation for audiovisual records, and Joe's going to go into this a bit more. It's a key tool in that it's essential. If you don't have the digitisation, you won't have anything to be fussing about for preservation. But for other types of records that we hold, digitisation, the prioritisation around it might be around access, and Anna's going to look at that a little bit in that way, because there's no doubt online, accessible, delivered to your door 24/7 is very attractive for people who are saying, what have you got all that stuff there for anyway? Yeah? And let's get it out, let's get it open. But of course, every time we have these mass digitisation projects, and Rani really exemplified what happens. It's a long-term thing. You're creating records that you're going to have to manage over time, particularly if you're digitising to change your business processes, and so you're no longer retaining the paper. The born digital, we've been working we work with electronic systems for 30 years. So we're hitting the open access periods for those in government archival institutions. And is it now, only really now we're tackling that in any great way? Why? Because it's really hard to get the funding in the first instance for the digital preservation, and Tania looked at that and the reasons how do you build that, and also Jay, you explored that as well. Here's this wonderful strategy, policy, signed up to it, but the actual realities of moving through the process so you can build those digital preservation tools. And so really, should the question be digitisation or digital preservation, and digitisation as part of that, versus digital preservation being part of digitisation? Sorry, that's a semantic distinction in some ways, but it's quite key, because if we change the rhetoric to being about digital preservation and make it sound as exciting as digitisation, surely then we can, and so the question is, how do we do that so that surely then we can actually change the rhetoric around it and change the engagement of the funding bodies in that. So I'm going to leave you with that thought, and I hope that some of you will have ideas and suggestions around that. And I think we can move on to Anna, and she's going to explore some of the other areas around it.
Okay, so my first reaction to this topic was, well, of course it isn't. As an archivist, I'm constantly annoyed by digitisation projects being described by the media as preserving our heritage or something of that ilk. Most digitisation projects are focused on access rather than preservation, and in most cases, the physical items being digitised will be stable and stored in archival conditions. And in these cases, the physical item is likely to far outlast its digital copy. Unless there is an ongoing plan to actively manage the digital files, they'll be at risk of bit rot, corruption, and obsolescence. And even if we assume for a moment that a digitisation project has a robust digital preservation plan in place, are we really preserving something by making a digital copy of it? Would we consider a letter or an artefact to be preserved if all we had was a digital image of it? Would we be happy to only have a digital image of Joseph Banks's journal, say, or a letter from your grandmother, to put a more personal spin on it? Digitisation of these items is not preserving the original artefact, except perhaps in reducing handling or in the event of a fire or disaster, but it is massively increasing the possible access. So a fragile manuscript can be read by anyone, anywhere in the world, and it can be transcribed and reused in ever-changing ways. If we see the definition of preservation as not just to protect, but also to keep alive. In this sense, digitisation is playing a part in the preservation or the ongoing life of the object. And then there are the times where digitisation is the only way of preserving an item. So this could be where the physical carrier is unstable and deteriorating, or technology changes make it difficult to access old formats. And I think Joe will speak to this more as an audiovisual archivist with some of the specific challenges around audiovisual media. And Asti spoke earlier also about some of the specific issues around preservation of time-based artworks, and digitisation is an important aspect of this. So in these cases, we need to make the best possible digital copy that we can, as this will become the preservation master as the physical original degrades. And likewise, colour photos, records printed on thermal paper, without digitising those kind of items, they'll be lost forever. So in this sense, digitisation can be a crucial part of digital preservation, and digital preservation is important for the long-term sustainability of a digitisation project. The two aren't in opposition to each other, instead they should be considered together, and they should be funded together. And there's the problem. I think the focus of funding bodies at the moment, at least from my experience, seems to be on digitisation projects. So across the GLAM sector, there's a real push to get more of our collections online, and that's great, of course. But often these grants are not backed up with digital preservation planning or ongoing investment in infrastructure. It's easy to give a small museum, say, a pot of funding to photograph their collection, but it's much more difficult to ensure that they'll be able to store and manage those images for the years to come. When I was at Tate, I worked on the Archives and Access project there, which was a major project over 3 years to digitise a large number of items from the archive. The project was funded by the Heritage Lotteries Fund, who did have some digital preservation experts on their advisory board, and Tate had to demonstrate a plan to ensure preservation of the digitised archives. So that was really valuable. We were given funding to adapt the digital asset management system, introduce some basic preservation metadata into our systems, and set up a digital preservation storage system. But even then, funding was only for the 3 years of the project. Beyond that, Tate would have to meet the ongoing cost of storage. We'd plan to expand the infrastructure and set up a preservation system for born digital artworks and archives from that. But it proved harder to secure funding for a preservation project than it was for an access project. In a time when most museum budgets were shrinking, making a case for increased operational spending was difficult. And now at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, I've been brought on board to work on a business case for digitisation. There was already recognition, though, that in order to achieve this, we would need to consider digital preservation. And as I've talked with staff across the organisation, a lot of common themes have emerged: difficulties in storing, managing and accessing digital assets. We need to make sure that digitisation is carried out in a sustainable way. We can also take this opportunity to look at our policies, processes and systems across the board. In the end, it's all about access, really, increasing access to our collections and ensuring access in the long term. And this was all good timing, as we're now involved in a project led by the New South Wales Cultural Infrastructure Program Management Office, SIPMO, who are developing a business case for digitisation across New South Wales cultural institutions. And there's also a regional project going on as well. So it's more important than ever that we advocate for digital preservation. We need to make sure that funding bodies understand the importance of digital preservation and ensure that funded projects are sustainable. And we need ongoing investment to manage the growing volumes of both digitised and born digital content in the long term.
Okay, it's my turn. So there's a bit of a theme emerging, semantics and inclusiveness. So I'm going to go ahead and say that for some audiovisual collections, digitisation is digital preservation. And because it's the only option for some deteriorating formats, there's some formats that can no longer be photochemically preserved. There's no real standard definition options anymore. Small gauge film, analog video, tape, magnetic tape in general. Renee mentioned that 20, deadline 20 something. Yeah, 25, sorry. But again, this is the semantic issue. I would say that as AV archivists, there's a lot of us in the room, we are trained with the notion that digital preservation encompasses the digitising or scanning of carriers. And then long-term storage and management of the collections, it's an all-encompassing thing, but we call it digital preservation. It's not separate. It's probably more in line with digital curation as a concept rather than just digital preservation. Now that I'm a digital curation specialist and I've looked at it, it's like, yeah, that makes more sense. But in the AV land, we just call it digital preservation. So the two National Archives both have extensive AV collections and they both have active digital preservation programs, and that's digitising, storing and management of those collections. And you'd have heard from Renee that it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all when it comes to outsourcing. There's still a gap, but internally, in-house, it's from beginning to end. Now, purists might actually say that this is not preservation at all, that a 4K scan of a 35mm print is not enough, that 8K is coming, is here, that until you capture every single grain to a pixel, you're not done. Try telling that to the people that are giving you the money. Because let's say, I'm going to say yes, we may have got it wrong. And we've gotten it wrong in the past. We may learn down the track that 2K scans for 16mm negatives is not enough, and we might have to do it again. There might be new technologies emerging that improve the process. Remember how awesome CDs were? Renee actually did a nice demo earlier when we transferred 1/4-inch tape to CD, thinking it was going to be amazing. Remember those things where they would bash CDs on the table and they were going to last forever?
The gold CD, I think, wasn't it? The gold CD.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, that worked really well. And, you know, we've all had massive ripping, I don't know we all, but a lot of us have had massive ripping programs where we've gone and now ripped those CDs. Remember when we copied 35mm nitrate film to 16mm film and chucked out the nitrate? We got that wrong too. So 35mm prints to SP Betacam. Yeah, I guess my point is that we may have to go back. We may have gotten it wrong. It might not be enough, but for now, it's all we have for some formats. But it's not exclusive. It's about so much more. I find that there's a lot of discussion about digitised, and our poor cousin born digital is often left out. I found that a lot of places that I've worked. So I would kind of go one step further than just talking about digitising. And this is where I would sort of support the idea that it's more around digital curation, that we're looking at the digital life cycle, and that we have always, as AV archivists, imposed digital preservation principles at the point of acquisition, that's key. So in a way that's more in line with the digital curation life cycle, that you're thinking about preservation always. It's drummed into you from acquisition all the way through to storage and management and preservation. Long-term preservation, long-term commitment. Yes. So yes, it is and it isn't.
Okay, so before I address this non-question in my mind, I want to ask another question of the audience. Why do these keep falling off? Does anyone have any? Thank you, any answer to that?
The glue is, but not as good as it
glue.
used to be.
We need better glue. Okay. The other comment I'd like to make right at the start is that if you're not an archivist, you should look very thoroughly at archival principles, because they are the key to managing digital stuff over time, that is digital preservation. Much as I hate to say this as a trained librarian, archivists have got it right in this respect. They really have. And I think it behoves us all to look very carefully excuse me, at what their body of practice is. And Julia did not make me say this, by the way. Okay, so we are asked...
Of the ASA is coming your way, Ross.
Yeah. So the question that we have been asked to consider on the panel is: digitisation is not digital preservation, or is it? But that's actually not even a question. It's simply a statement of fact. Digitisation is not digital preservation. I think we all agree on that one. It never was, it never will be. One is not the other, and we have to be very, very clear on this. So why are we even talking about this, I wonder? And the reason we are talking about it is because it's a misconception out there. Hopefully some of you who had this misconception half an hour ago don't have it anymore. Excuse me, and won't have it. I'm out of practice in speaking to people, so my voice is going croaky. Sorry about that. So to me, the real question, the one we should be looking at, is why have we failed to get this message across, that digitisation is not digital preservation? There are so many information professionals, generally managers, providers of funding, who persist in thinking that it's okay that all the money and effort go into short-term thinking, into digitisation, without considering the medium and long-term questions. So we need to persuade those who fund us that they cannot fund digitisation only. And I was really interested in the example from the Tate about funding for digitisation being contingent to some extent on demonstrating preservation capacity. Wouldn't it be great if we could somehow build that into our processes, that our funding agencies recognised that as an issue? In the States, this is happening to some extent, by the way. Wow. Okay. So that's a great example. As preparation for this short speech, I carried out some extensive research, and I found 2 tweets. The research took about 10 minutes. 2 tweets that were really interesting. And the first of them was digitisation is not digital preservation. And that was in response to a tweet which was inviting people to answer the question, what's something that seems obvious within your profession but the general public seems to misunderstand? So I'm not even sure it's obvious within our profession or professions yet. We've got a long way to go. There's a phrase I have liked for a long time and used a lot, and it's the term digital mortgage. If we engage in anything digital in terms of preservation or digitising, there's a mortgage attached. We have to keep paying and paying and paying. And as people who, presumably many of you, buy or own property in Sydney, you will know about mortgages, I think, more than most of us. That's a bad joke from someone from Melbourne, I think. And the other tweet that really resonated with me was in relation to a tweet about Google's 3D scans aim to preserve historical sites. Well, they do nothing of the sort. And the tweet said, altogether now, digitisation is not preservation, and repeat. And I'm tempted to stand up and conduct us as we chant this, but maybe next time. I've got lots of examples, and we've heard many of them, where digitisation was simply not the answer, where a lot of money was put in. The material is now inaccessible, some of it important stuff, some of it from the State Library of Victoria, some of it from this state library as well. The examples are not hard to find. So the crux of the matter, and we all agree on this, is that digital preservation is much, much more than getting hold of a digital version, maybe with good documentation attached. And that's all that digitisation does, basically. It's so much more than that. And we have to get that lesson across to funders, managers, but it seems we have so far failed. And I hope the discussion that follows can raise some questions, some ideas about how we might start to address that situation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ross. Before we go out to the audience, I give the opportunity for the panel members actually to agree or disagree with each other. And I saw Joe moving a little bit when you said that everyone agrees that digitisation is not digital preservation. So maybe I might kick off with Joe.
Yeah, I think that I agree to a point, but I think, yes, it is digitisation is critical it's a critical role, but it is critical. It is digital preservation for some formats. There's no other option. So that is our Pres Master. You might have destroyed the tape running it through when you digitize it. And that's all you have. So you have to make sure, and it has to be done at the right resolution, highest resolution, no compression. It needs to be the best possible quality copy that exists. And that's why I'm saying, we may have made mistakes. We're doing the best that we can right now, but there's no other option. Yes, you then have to store it, look after it, and do all the, digital preservation things.
Of course.
Respond to that. I've got grey hair, and I tend to lapse into reminiscences. And here's one of them coming up. Well over 30 years ago, pre-digital basically, I ran a microfilming program for newspapers in another country. And there were certainly newspapers there that could be handled once. The paper they were on was so fragile that one handling in order to film them was all that was going to happen. They disintegrated. They fell into tiny pieces, literally, and could not be put together. So I do agree that digitizing, if we make the leap from microfilm to a digital version, which incidentally is not that difficult to do. There are machines that do that. You can buy them easily. So I do agree that for some material, digitizing is the preservation mechanism, but we still have to remember that it's only the start of the process.
Well, I think I'll jump in there because I have an issue. I mean, we mentioned acquisition at one point, Joe, and that the issues start at that point. And they really, we're talking about 30 years of archival theory. It's all been about the issues start at the point of creation. And that's where you've got to make the difference. And that's the big point of difference between what 30 years ago was called electronic records, and we would now only ever call digital records. We never use the word electronic anymore, but almost never. But the point there is that if you're thinking about, say, if we go back to Matthew's talk earlier this morning, which was, looking at the wonderful work that the State Library is doing and automating ingestion and pulling out. What's coming? If you're going to automate it, what's sitting at the heart of these files? It's got to be, one, that they're identified for long-term preservation, but two, that they have inbuilt within them the metadata, the information. That means you don't have to have the manual handling. Otherwise, you can sit there and you're trying to work out what this email was about, and if you don't have all that information sitting behind it within the record-keeping system or within the if it's a personal in the cloud or in the business system or whatever source that the content comes from. If you don't have that there, the automation tools that are being developed to ingest what are vast quantities of digital content, whether it's digital object files that you're digitizing, so the photographs that go out and then you're building all these photos, you're moving them from analog to digital, or they're born digital photographs, or any other type of record, email, business systems data that's extracted. If there aren't if that information isn't sitting behind it because it wasn't identified at the point of creation for long-term preservation, it remains a laborious, difficult, and probably ultimately futile task. not ultimately futile, because we're going to go back to the here we've acquired this stuff and we have to work out a way to preserve it. But that's timely, that's costly. That's the thing that's almost impossible to manage when you're talking about vast numbers of digital objects. And that's the bit that we want to change people's habits around. And we've understood that we've needed to do that for a long time, but it remains incredibly difficult to shift the conversation and to shift the interest of people that this is what's required. It's much, and we've seen this demonstrated in many states across Australia, it's much easier to build massive or invest in big digitization projects than to build digital archives to hold those records. So that was my issue about the use of the word acquisition. I think we shouldn't be doing this at the point of acquisition. To some extent, Ross and Joe's idea of whether you're dealing with the audiovisual tape that, if you don't format shift it, it will not be playable because the hardware will not be available to play it. And the paper that crumbles on touch, and so therefore you have to digitize. I mean, they're both examples of having acquired records at the point of which you've got to deal with them. Whereas if we could step back and say, we know these are going to be archival or going to be required for the long term for whatever reason, business, legal, historical, and make a point, understand at that point that the difference, the preservation techniques have to be built into its management. That's what I would say about that, which I know you agree with.
Can I respond to that? Well, 2 examples, because what we've done here at the State Library is actually an education process with our donors or people that we are commissioning about how to, the technology or the technical standards, and also the type of metadata that they give us. So it's been it's been a bit of a slow process, but it's been about upskilling the acquisition staff. It's about talking to authors and creators. But it's something that we did at the NFSA many, many years ago, where we started talking to producers and then to post houses, and actually skipping producers and going straight to post houses and saying, look, when you prepare this or when you finish this, this is how we want it. And so you're actually, even before, and that went right through to government funding, and how if you were funded, therefore you had to provide it to us in this way. So that's kind of what I meant by point of acquisition, is that you're educating your audience. And I think we could probably do that more. We went to SPA, the Professional Producers Conference, and said, hey, this is what we need for long term. And actually you could do that with writers. You could do that with whoever your constituents are. Like, start thinking about your collection, start thinking about your email, how you're going to organise it, empty your trash, like all that kind of stuff. That so that, yes, but getting that message out there.
Anna, did you want to share anything?
I guess when we start thinking about that, it's really important to communicate what we need in terms of documentation. That's what Asti was speaking about earlier, about gathering as much information from the artist at the time of acquisition for digital artworks. And in terms of digitization, that's really important as well, that we make sure we're capturing good metadata, that we have everything catalogued in a consistent way. We know what we have and we know what we need to preserve in the long term. So documentation, a really important part of digitization and digital preservation.
The other thing that I wanted that as people were talking came to my mind was thinking, because if we go back to the idea of the digital archive, what's difficult about just saying we'll digitise for access is that it isn't always possible to provide that access. You need to digitise for preservation, but access isn't an automatic byproduct of that. And that's about access management. Obviously, the accessibility to the object is improved with digitisation. But if I put my NIDA hat on for a minute, I've got hundreds of hours of audio-visual material that ought to be format shifted if it's going to be retained as an archive. But probably it shouldn't have even been taken in the first place. It was breaching an awful lot of rights in developing that, not just actors' rights. Archival recordings are allowed under the MEAA agreements, for instance, but music rights, perhaps. don't know what the APRA agreements were looking like in the 80s when they started doing that. Probably nothing there. The script rights, because sometimes if you're actually going to record a script, regardless of the archival recording nature of it, you actually need to have paid for it to be to take an archival recording, which is a one-off recording with one camera ostensibly sort of filming the production. Visuals that might have been used in that. Did anybody think about that when they were getting those archival recordings together? And so that's great. Can you give me hundreds of thousands of dollars to digitise this, but can't do anything with it? But it will be preserved, and we'll work out the copyright later. And of course, there will be, I mean, it's just one example, and I know many of you will have similar ones around the copyright and other rights management that go with the digital, and therefore building access into it. So that's the other side of it, of why it can be very difficult to seek that funding for it. And that I just sort of thought I'd mention as well. That's why it's difficult, and it remains difficult. And Terry looked at that a little bit with some of the technology around the social media and things. But yeah, so another point to bring into it. I'm sure you have experiences you can share too.
Fantastic. We've heard a lot of strong views, I guess, from the panel. We'll open up the questions to the audience. Start with, yeah.
Hello. So I hope it turns into a question. It may just be a stream of consciousness. But when I hear you talking about access, there's this one thing that keeps popping back into my mind, and I go, physical. And for me, there's this huge gap between physical access and virtual access, and even down to how do we convince the people who make the decisions about the money that, it's so widely recognised that in order to preserve a film, we have to store it in -20 and they go in freezers, and that we climate condition everything, to international standards, and that you spend millions of dollars every year on your physical storage, and that's just the way it goes. But we're not there yet with digital storage. And I suppose when I just keep hearing access, that the internet is this magical thing. And if people are still thinking of it as a physical thing, that I physically access this thing on a web page, just like I physically go to the store and I touch the tape. What are we missing? What language do we need to form, or cohesive strategy in order to speak to digital access and virtual storage systems?
Yeah, no, I think it's a real shift in thinking that's needed. We've talked a lot about how we convince management about the need for ongoing investment in digital storage when it's assumed that we need that for physical. And in a sense, what we're doing at the moment with some of our digital collections is like, we compare that to leaving a crate of paintings out in the rain. But it's not recognised as being at such a direct risk, I guess. And I think risk is something it's hard to get a lot of traction behind, talking about risk.
Disaster story to get people to pay attention, right?
Yeah.
We need to share more disaster stories.
Yeah. I think it's hard to keep that as a tangible risk that will happen without those kind of stories of when it has happened. People see it as just a quite abstract thing, and they're used to being able to just find everything that they need on the internet. So I don't know, how do we communicate that better?
I think we need to think about how we define and talk about our collection, because when you have emails and whatever other kind of digital objects, you actually need to have boundary around your digital collection and treat it like you would your physical collection. And it's often difficult to get traction on that, I think. It is collection material. It's not, it doesn't have it shouldn't have the same sort of treatment as just other regular IT stuff does. Like you need to define it, think about where it's going to be, start talking and advocating for it to government like it's a collection, it's part of your collection. But then I also know there's some organisations that don't think digitised copies are part of the collection. I think that needs to change, that actually copies, though they're not necessarily copies, they have a value and they should be part of your collection. It's not just an add-on to your email system and all that kind of stuff. It is. We have to start talking about our collections like that.
I have a different approach to this, I suspect. All of what we've said so far is still us information professionals talking among ourselves, basically. And I think we need to move well away from that. And my line of thinking goes a bit like this. It's very naive, so bear with me. Who gives us the funding ultimately? The people with the money, often government. So let's take the example of governments who hand money out to various projects for digitising. Who influences those people? The people who vote for the members of parliament or those who make up the government. So we need to get at the people, the unwashed masses, if you like, to use that terrible term, and somehow change the mindsets of people out there. And I have absolutely no idea how
more
we do
disaster
that.
stories.
Yeah, more disaster stories. I have in my time thought of actively making a digital disaster, but luckily my ethical background has overridden that wish. But I think we've got to somehow make people know, maybe through the media, more that there's a real issue here.
Well, when you say access and physical access, I don't think that. It's a little bit like preservation. It could be digital or it could be physical. It could be access. I think a record to me could be of any format. So I think some of the terminology that I might use isn't necessarily format dependent in that way. But let me just, I'll come back in a second and expand there. But I think in terms of, you're absolutely right that it is not isolated and we have to work. And maybe Tanil, you mentioned about collaboration. If I think about my workplace, I can go and get the most wonderful money for digitising, but it's got to be stored somewhere. So who am I dealing with there? The IT department. And so then you've got to invest them into it because, okay, storage is really cheap. That was the language 10 years ago, just buy more, we don't want buildings, but we'll just buy more and more RAM, we'll build it up, all that. Because we've understood now that big data isn't always, what do you do with that as well? You've got to back it up. You've got to be able to manage it over time. What do we do with all those PST files that are sitting there from people's emails account that are somehow managed to escape the notice of the records manager and have just been accumulating in a server over here, and what are we going to do with those? So it is about dialogue and engagement. I think and it's both at the system developers, it's both at the IT storage, it's both at the funding bodies, as Ross says. So it isn't to work in isolation is the problem if we think we can do it without working across the sector. In terms of the user expectation about access, yes, it is true you're combating the Google search. It's like one hit and I've got to the item. And, of course, archivists don't always deal that well with items. We deal with a whole lot of other things before we get to the items. So the pressure's on to provide it. But, I think you're always navigating that. I think most archivists in the room will think, what Ross is just saying about how do you promote what we do. That's our daily job. We get out there and think, how do we promote what we do? It's so important. We're just, the organisation would fail without the archivist, but, they don't believe that. So you've got to constantly go out and advocate for that, yeah? So when you work in a private organisation, you're always selling what you do. It's not, your reason for being is about making it accessible and usable for where you work. Perhaps in a collecting institution it is a bit different because that's your raison d'etre to be here, and now you're just valuating to that. But so perhaps I look at it slightly differently because of that, and I think, well, you're always trying to do this, you're always trying to maximise that engagement, whatever the format. But
No, I really appreciate that. And I guess one of the things that we sort of deal with at the gallery is how do you make it sexy? How do you make it sexy for benefactors? If you have 2 minutes in the coffee line with the money dude, you know, in his fancy suit, how do you tell that story and get him walking away and thinking about it?
But that's for an 1850s record or a, you know, as well. And what it is always about, it's about building the connections, because the disaster story can work because, you know, that nothing focuses the mind like the fact that they're up before the courts and they haven't actually got that evidence. Sure, that's one strategy that archivists have been using for decades, no problem. The other is, as soon as I'm able to answer your special need, your special query, you are invested in what we do, you know, and it meant something to you. So that's always the challenge.
Can I make a very quick comment about IT people and IT departments?
We love them, really.
Yeah,
They're listening.
exactly, and I hope we do. I can think of two organisations that may be models in this case. One of them has worked really hard over a very large number of years now to find the right kind of IT people and keep them and work on paying them more and getting around the government structures, the federal government structures that restrict all that, and they are doing really good things. Another one I know, as well as where Jay works, is the attempts that she and others have made to sidle up to the IT people and talk to them and start to understand each other, and sometimes yell at them. I know that from experience because I've been part of it on occasion, but it's no good just saying, and sorry, Julia, the IT people are an impediment.
They're stakeholders in this process.
They are part of it as much as we are.
I would say I've had experience with every type of IT department, extremely cooperative and wonderful, like the State Library people, down to we're not in the same industry, but we work with the same organisation, but we're not in the same industry. I can't help you. I don't want to. You're annoying me. So you're right. It's critical, and it's all about constantly making the connection with them and saying, no, what we're doing is important, and we need your help to do it. There's principles. It's all kosher. But really, that's what my job has been for years, is actually making those connections with IT. Sometimes successfully. Sometimes you have to break things to get their attention. Sometimes you have to knock over the network to get their attention. Not saying I've done that here, this is in the past. But because, like I said before, the technical people here have been fantastic. It's been one of the most amazing progressive relationships between for digital preservation and acquisition. But yeah, it's a critical relationship.
I think just making sure you're sort of speaking the same language and unpacking kind of what you mean by preservation storage versus what an IT person thinks that means. And what was it, Jay, this morning? Was it you talking about that you're defining what you mean by preservation storage? Someone mentioned that they were, which I think is a really important thing to do and to be able to articulate what that means for us.
Can we get a mic?
Yeah, that was talking about a group of international practitioners have put together this preservation storage criteria, and they are up to version 3 of this. We've used it in some workshops with our IT people, and that has been instrumental in getting progress around this shared language. And Andrea, who I mentioned earlier, will be speaking in August at our online meetup about that criteria, so it'll be really useful.
Thank you. We've got some more questions.
Hi, I'm Susan Kennedy from City of Sydney Archives. Everyone's talking about talking to IT people, which is great, but nobody's actually talked about talking to the board, the board of directors, and talking, do we have a digital preservation strategy across the whole of your organisation? You touched on it, Ross, talking about who are the funders. If you're your average Joe in your organisation, you can see how WHS has got a grip on your organisation, or how environmental policies have a grip on your organisation. they are the type of things that hit at the image of your organisation. So I'm just asking how much, well, basically, why isn't digital preservation up there in a corporate-wide strategy that is going to affect the image of your organisation or the funding?
I might keep this with Anna, because you talked about SITMO, which
Yeah.
was maybe a relevant.
Yeah, I mean, no, I absolutely agree that policy needs to be in place, and I think just that process of developing the policy and talking across the organisation, getting agreement on what you're trying to do and defining that is really valuable, and then getting that recognition from the executive level, your board, is crucial, and that's going to be the next stage for us at the art gallery. At the moment, it's quite segmented, like between different departments. So we want to get a more coordinated approach to that. And yeah, with the SITMO project as well, I think that's going to become even more important, and to look at like what we have in common across different institutions as well. So not just internally, but what some of the common issues are across the different institutions.
Say it's the first thing that I did when I started here was obvious there was no digital. There's a preservation policy, but not a digital preservation policy, and we had invested in a digital preservation system. So the first thing that we did was draft and talk to, communicate across the whole organisation, and get that through executive, that we would all commit to these principles, and then look at a strategy coming from that.
Amy had another question.
Hi, I work in the IT department at a government department, but I work in the records information management team, and I was wondering if you think like better organizational alignment between archives and IT should be happening in the cultural sector. I've come from the ABC, but now I'm at Treasury, and at the ABC I worked in archives there, and that now comes under technology. And do you think that maybe you would get more funding for things if archives really became part of technology and you were writing your digital preservation policies with IT as a combined thing? So if you're not two separate things competing for money and competing for projects and seeing who should lead this project, but if in fact you should be working together as one team, and if that would improve your chances of getting this funding for digital preservation.
Ross, did you want to jump in? I was going to say that, I mean, it has been something that, for instance, if we focus on GLAM for a moment, and the sort of growth of everything GLAM, GLAM-I, GLAMer, all sorts of acronyms that can abound. And I sometimes think it does the archive community a disservice, because in fact we really ought to be extending not just to the libraries and museum and gallery sector, which is one part of what we do, but in fact the vast bulk of what we do is really within the, why are we not extending the same connections to the data managers associations, information management, the computer society, ACS and things, because that is actually where the bulk of our work is really based. And that's what you're reflecting in your comments there a little bit, because the practicalities, not for everybody necessarily on this panel, but certainly within a record keeping framework, is that you're actually working at the IT side of the business, and you need to engage that. And how do you build? And I think, I mean, to me, I see it ever increasing the gap rather than coming together. So how do we build a shared language where we can build on that? Again, still recognising the differences, but I mean, I think it is critical. I haven't got any solutions there for you, but it is about, I recognise it as well, that it's really a space that we ought to be talking in and be able to share experiences and bring across the table there and work together more. Ross, you were...
Just a comment that I think that approach would privilege digital preservation. Many of us are still in organizations where preserving digital stuff is only part of the whole preservation action activities. So that might only work in some kinds of organizations where digital preservation is maybe the only kind of preservation that happens.
I've seen it in different organisations move in and out of preservation. So let's move digital preservation into IT. Oh, that doesn't work. Let's move it out. Let's move it back. Let's move it out. So I think we've got a nice setup here where we don't actually have a digital preservation section, but we've got technical people and not curators, we're digital collections people working together. But I've seen it moved around and around, whether you're doing just digital or physical. The hard fit.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say too, for our organisation, there's so many different areas that would need to be working with IT. So it's more probably a case of just improving that communication across the organisation, and kind of upskilling within each area and making sure there's kind of digital expertise in each area that perhaps can better communicate with IT.
I think it's also interest. I know when we started doing proper digital preservation at the NFSA, I think it was 2005, or acquisitions, it was getting the IT person that was interested and wanted to learn more about it or do stuff with us that wasn't just something's outside of the norm, and come on the journey with us and be interested. And then I've been elsewhere where it's like not interested in what you're doing at all. But yeah, finding that person that's interested and willing to help you. And even now, like with our old obsolete technology, getting the IT people to help us with, the clapped out Mac that we have, that kind of thing it's not really part of the, the regular rollout of IT. It's a separate thing, but can you just help us?
Hi, I'm Tanya from UNSW. Does that sound right?
Yep.
I hope my question is not too off topic and it's for the panel or anyone in the audience. The context is an institutional repository containing born digital publications deposited by researchers. So nothing as interesting as art or social media. So my question is the purpose of digital preservation. So we're toying with file formats PDF versus PDF-A. So if it's in PDF-A, it is for long-term storage, but if we keep it in a PDF, which may have embedded video or audio, then we're preserving the original copy as is. So is preservation about preserving the original as is, or is it for long-term access?
Well, I think we all want to jump on that one. Thank you for the question. It's about both. There's no question at all. And sometimes there are compromises that are necessary. So it may be that the long-term preservation aspects in terms of format override some of keeping the original because we don't know how to do that. So I think it's up to you and your organization to try and figure out what the balance is in relation to what you are trying to do.
We're keeping the original file, and if needs be, making a modified master that's more accessible or easier to access. But we are keeping original born digital files.
Yeah, I think that would be the ideal, to keep the original and perhaps make a normalized copy, we might call it, because you never know how you might want to be able to access that original file in the future. There's emulation options and things like that. But I think in making the decision about normalizing, you need to look at what it is in that record that you're trying to preserve and make sure that you're not, removing any of those significant aspects of the record by migrating the format. So the safest thing is to keep the original as well.
Well, of course, the State Records Act allows destruction post-2000 of records that have been digitised. So you're going to have to deal with those ones if you're processing that. Perhaps another side, for yes, all these things, but also then, of course, if you've got data that's extracted from business systems and you're viewing it as ASCII files that, need the software to actually provide you with the context of how they were interpreted at the time. There's all those sorts of conversations that have been happening again for a long time about how you actually, or what you're preserving. And as Ross says, to some extent, it's the particular nature of the organisation, the nature of the series of records, the type of digital objects that we're talking about, what's actually achievable with the technology that's around today versus, and then those decisions, well, do we destroy the nitrate because we've got a lot of nitrate and we're near some, smokers up around the corner or something? I don't know. There are different ways of doing it. Can you keep everything? No, you can't. So you have to make strategic decisions, and you hope your strategic decisions, which have been well thought out, discussed, addressed and documented, will see you well into the future. But no doubt mistakes are made. It's the same with disposal or appraisal anyway. You can be sure someone's asking for the file that you legitimately got rid of last week. So how are you going to look at those digital records in the future? Again, it's at the point of creation and developing these things that you start to take a long-term view. But again, documenting what you do, you have to make some decisions around it. You cannot retain everything, and particularly if you've invested vast amounts of money, then it can be hard to justify. I thought you were giving, I'm giving you all this money so we don't have to have the physical repository anymore. What do you mean you still want to keep all the student records as well as the digitised ones that we now have to format shift every 5 years? So they're quite difficult conversations that can happen around that, and part of the nature of it, I guess.
Okay.
As a recovering service desk agent and IT technician, I can comment and support, say that yes, please do come and talk to us, but also whether we're on site or off site, there will always be people who are willing to hear you. It's just about fostering it, like you said. Also, as an archetypal IT technician, I'm also quite suspicious. So my question is, might be a little bit more paranoid than most. Because I now work in GLAM, and also because of what we perceive as the role of digitisation within archives and libraries and galleries and museums. There's also the precedent that it sets for what happens to that object once it's digitised, regardless of what our intent is when we digitise it. Let's say it's not part of a collection, but part of the city, a building, a bridge, something like that. How do we ensure that through our actions of digitisation that those objects are still under some kind of protection, and that our digitisation doesn't lay a precedent for that object to then be disposed of now that a good quality record, in inverted commas, has been captured?
You mean the physical?
The physical object, yes.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
Because it is exactly what Julia was saying. It's like, here's all this money, now go away. It's like someone asking me, if we've digitized that film, are we done now? No, not necessarily. And it goes back to your question about which copy as well, because you got to keep the original. Well, I'm a purist. You have to keep the original. Because you just never know. There might be better technology that's just around the corner that will get you a better quality copy. It's not realistic, but it's keep it.
So are there any strategies for how to communicate these to the people who believe that some areas of cultural heritage stand in the way of progress and, again, in inverted commas? Yeah.
Just thinking of the, surely it's obviously, the 3D printer, you'll be able to get all those images and you'll be able to recreate it. So you don't actually need to keep the physical object, because when we want it, we can just rebuild it, can't we? No, I'm being silly, I'm being facetious, of course. But I don't know. It is, I don't think there's anything perfect. You can take a photograph and then it's gone. the original. I mean, this happens. Interesting, I was thinking about it from the point of view of being a performing arts archivist, because sometimes it can be quite a hard sell, because there's some purists out there who say the record is the performance. And by nature, everything else that surrounds it is tangential and is not the record then. So how do you justify retaining all these records about something which is not the actual thing? There's a lot of theory of books, papers been written on this in great detail, you know. But is a classic thing of it isn't. I mean, it is their records, but they're actually all referencing the original.
Excuse me. One strategy I have seen work quite well is to still keep the original, depending on what it is, but to put it in lower cost storage, because often it's the cost of storage in the central repository. You say the cost of storage here, for example, is way higher than it will be in a suburb, I don't know, 30 Ks, 40 Ks out. And you can still maintain quality storage elsewhere at a lower cost.
Thank you very much.
That is interesting, I guess. Working here at the State Library, we're probably taking a different view, Ross, on whether we use lower cost storage for the access copy versus the preservation copy. Our digitisation program is, it's very expensive, I guess, the storage, and we are investigating cloud storage strategies. So selfishly, I'm going to ask a question. In terms of cloud storage, does anyone on the panel have any opinions on using cloud storage?
Yeah, we've had discussions about that at the gallery. At the moment, we have real issues with storage. We have like on-site server storage only, and it's very limited and not really suitable for digital preservation. And so sort of the obvious thing that people say is, well, have you thought about the cloud? And we have, but there are difficulties with the size of some of the files that we're talking about. Some of Asti's video artworks are enormous, so we have to think about keeping them actually accessible. We need to access the masters fairly often, as well as kind of smaller access derivatives. So there are sort of issues, and people sort of talk about cloud storage as if it's cheap, but if you need that kind of regular access to your content, it's not cheap.
So to me, and this might be controversial, but it's untested. We don't really know. I know that there are some large organisations using it, but I come from AV where it's tape land, and it's very, your preservation is very tangible. You've got 3 copies on 3 different tape stocks in 3 different geographic locations. It's very, you know where they are, and you've got control over that. So coming into a library where it's not that, it's all disk space, is an adjustment. But I also just think we need to be cautious because it's a little untested. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, in the end, it's just a soccer field of servers somewhere in the world. It's just infrastructure that you're outsourcing. And the costs around it are the thing to watch if you're looking at it. It seems a little bit cheaper because you're just doing this part of it and you haven't got your sort of outsourced IT at this point to the cloud, or there's a mediator there. Probably in the organisation, but all you're doing is you're outsourcing the hardware and then the platforms and things as service. But so it's fine, it might suit your strategy, but the costs around it, the back and forth, the transfer of boxes of records, but digital boxes of records remains a cost of doing business, and it's a business cost, whether it's physical or digital. So I think it's, again, about the realities of storage. Yes, it doesn't look like it's an asset that I'm managing directly, but it is still an asset that I'm managing somewhere in the world. And all the, sometimes simpler, but probably more complicated once you actually unpack it all. And of course, then we start to deal with the rights of it all, and where is it actually, it comes under different jurisdictions then, depending on where it's located. So there's a whole range of other things that are around it. But it can be a solution for a smaller organisation that maybe doesn't have the IT infrastructure. But you would, again, from a digital preservation point of view, if you're going to digitise your content and stick it in the cloud somewhere, from a digital preservation point of view, you've got to look at that ongoing management of the content over time, wherever it is.
There are organisations who know, which know a lot about digital preservation. That's the business they are in, that will manage your cloud storage for you, and it costs. Question of that. One of them, the one I know of, is called Jura Cloud. It's US based. Tends to deal with smaller quantities, but when I last looked at the prices about 4-5 years ago, they were quite high. But they managed the whole process very effectively, I thought. The other publication I have, in mind is either from the Public Records Office in the UK or the National Archives in the UK, and it specifically asks the question, should we use cloud storage for digital preservation, and basically comes to the conclusion that yes, it is acceptable given certain conditions. So I think it's a given, it's happening out there already. We shouldn't be too concerned about it, as long as the costs and the issues about who owns it and where it is, which are crucial for some organisations, as long as they are addressed.
Yeah, I think the other thing about it is that it's a different cost model as well, which can be attractive in that it's a more known kind of annual cost, that you know how much budget you need every year. You can sort of plan for that as an annual cost, whereas maintaining your own storage infrastructure has all sorts of, it gets really complicated, I know from experience at Tate, trying to plan for when particular parts of your servers are going to need replacement and all of that. It's kind of less regular, large capital costs.
I mean, I don't know if someone from State Records here wants to answer in terms of the digital archive and distributed custody with agencies. I mean, it's a similar thing in a way. If you've got other organisations that are holding records that come under your jurisdiction, and I mean, how much input do you have into their infrastructure and their management in order to ensure that they're manageable? I mean, I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but I can see a couple of people here. But I mean, I think it is around that how do you ensure the sort of even a library. I mean, there are repositories, regional repositories, perhaps through the library or some of the other centres. And how do you manage to have the same quality and build that into other people's budget lines? I guess in a way, isn't it?
I think it's about how you, going back to something we were talking about earlier, about how you talk about your collection as well, and that you have to be really clear about the boundaries of your collection, and that it is part of your collection, and that how you manage it, and it's all that digital preservation stuff. But if you're going to a different cost model or a different way, that you are talking about the value of this thing, so that in 5 years' time they don't go, sorry, your budget's cut, you can't do that anymore, and it's all out of your control to a point. I know that's alarmist, but it is reality that you might have your budget cut. So it's about starting now, and I think SIPMO, I'm hoping, will help with this, around saying this is why this is valuable, this is our collection, it's like our physical collection, it needs this type of long-term commitment, funding commitment, because we have to have all of these certain types of health checks and functionality and migration and all of that kind of stuff, that we start talking about it like it's a one thing, so that we can continue to advocate for the funding of it, because it's risk. It's not shared services cloud, but it's kind of like that could happen. So
yeah, I mean, the issue of sustainability is key to all of this, of course, and it remains the same with the physical thing. You take things in, there's a trust dividend that's there, that you're going to manage it over time. And I think, I don't know if anyone here's from the National Library, but the Trove experience would be an example of although not everything's about digital preservation content within that, but I mean a lot of their initiatives over the years have been around building those digital collections, and then how do you make that sustainable and manageable. So there were really funding issues with the platform, and it's almost, again, because of victim of zone success at one point, because it was so popular way of ingesting content coming across, but then suddenly they've got left with having to manage this over time. So and there's some of the difficulties around it.
Okay, I think we're very close to wrapping up. Can we take maybe one or two questions from social media?
Yeah, there's a comment here saying there's a question on Twitter about the preservation of the digital access work being done by Glam Peak, and is anyone in the audience perhaps able to answer this? Everything else is very strong opinions about IT and archives. That seems to be the only actual question so far.
I have a question, Euwe. Damien Cassidy, mic runner and audiovisual archivist. Digitisation, it's more than preservation. It's also about the access and the reuse. And something that's been grappling with my head lately is, this question, is 2K good enough for 16mm film? And, jury's out, but maybe it is good enough to project it and make it look exactly like it. But is it good enough for someone to then take a peek at that film, zoom in to the top 1/3 on the left hand in a 4K production? So digitisation doesn't stop with preservation. We have to really think about the possible uses of things. And we do talk about access as in being able to access that object, recreate it, reform it back. It's the repurposing and the reuse, and as a archivist / artist, I think about that one a lot.
Do you mean like future-proofing?
To an extent, yeah.
Yeah, and I think seeing digitisation as an ongoing process. I mean, we don't want to be doing it more than we need to. We don't want to be handling original objects more than we need to, but it's never going to be done. It's never going to be complete. Even planning digitisation at the art gallery, where we're looking at rephotographing works that have already been photographed, but we can improve on those, and we can improve on the documentation of our more complex art installations and things. So it's never done.
That's a really difficult thing to sell, that we're not ever going to be possibly ever finished, because something new and better will come along that'll give us that, XYZ color space planning for blah blah technical, whatever it is, that it's hard to sell that.
Yeah, I know. Recently the BBC X-rayed a blocked film frame by frame, layer by layer, and recreated the footage with that, which no one would have ever thought possible 5 years ago. So what's going to be possible in 10 or 15 years?
That's why you keep the original.
That's why you keep the original.
Everyone.
But I think in some cases, the content and what its purpose is and what it is, I think there are cases where digitisation standards are very much good enough. A dodgy old cassette of a noisy environment interview, coming back in 10 years' time to get another half a dB at 16K, doesn't matter. Like, you have captured it in good enough for any usage as that. It's better than it was, really. So there are things to think about. But I think talking about storage and cloud-based storage, it does concern me when storage is an issue about preservation formats.
Yeah.
When we speak 2K versus 4K, the really only issue there is storage.
Yep. Agree.
Okay, we're going to have to slowly wrap up. So I've heard some common themes here. Actually, I'd like to hear more of a future panel around sustainability, because that seems to be something that has arisen from this. But I might finish this with some closing thoughts from each one of the panel members. And also, if you can just let us know in one word, because it's been very fantastic, the conversation, whether you do agree or disagree with the statement of digitisation is not preservation. One word for that answer, but then maybe a closing thought. So would you?
I'm going to be tricky. I'm going to go toolkit. So you need to think of your toolkit for digital preservation. That'll include digitisation, but it isn't limited to it.
Okay, well done. That was a workaround.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to say no as my one word, but yeah, it's not that black and white as we've talked about. We can't really have one without the other.
Sometimes.
And I think we know what Ross is thinking.
So, no.
All right, please put your hands together and thank the panel. And hand over to Matt for closing.
All right. So I just want to thank the panel and the speakers for their time and insight today, particularly those who have travelled interstate. It's really much appreciated. And also to those who helped put the event together today. I'd also like to thank Ignite Services, who sponsored our morning tea this morning. So I hope some people had a chance to talk to them. I do also want to apologise to those on the live stream. We did have some buffering issues, but we will be providing access to the recording afterwards, provided that it recorded okay. This is the first time I've done it. And we look forward to continuing these discussions through the Australasia Preserves community of practice. So we do have monthly online meetings, which Jay has mentioned about. And make sure you join the Google group to keep up to date on what's happening and also to ask questions. So that's all over Twitter. I think I can bring up links there as well. But yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you everyone for being involved.
Can I say thank you to Matt as well for doing such a fantastic job organising today.
Thank you.